It's time for the Phil Ferguson Show.
Well, hello there. This is Phil Ferguson, and you are listening to the cleverly titled The Phil Ferguson Show. It is late July, maybe early August by the time I put this up, of 2022, and we are going through the Polaris plan. I did part 1 2 episodes ago, talked about an overview, so if you haven't heard that, go listen to that. I talk about books you can read, why to have all kinds of different assets, why to have index funds. Part 2 talked more about the specifics of the allocation between bonds, or what I call the cushion, and stocks, and why you should have that, and why that diversification is helpful, and why if you're a pretty long time from retirement, maybe you don't need bonds at all if you can handle the market swings, because that's how you make the maximum money in the long run, is by taking a little bit more risk in the short run. Once you get to roughly 14 or 15 years from retirement, you should start building the cushion until it's fully stocked about 5 years before retirement. And that way, if you have enough money 5 years before retirement, or close to enough money, even if the market goes down, it doesn't disrupt your retirement date unless you had a bad break, or you don't want to quit working. Maybe that's your choice. That's up to you. But today I'm going to talk about what's in the cushion specifically, and we'll come back to that right after this quick little break.
If there is a God, if there is, I think most reasonable people might agree that he's at least incompetent and maybe, just maybe, doesn't give a shit. Doesn't give a shit, which I admire in a person and which would explain a lot of these bad results. So rather than be just another mindless religious robot, mindlessly and aimlessly and blindly believing that all of this is in the hands of some spooky, incompetent father figure who doesn't give a shit, I decided to look around for something else to worship, something I could really count on. And immediately I thought of the sun. Happened like that. Overnight, I became a sun worshiper. Well, not overnight, you can't see the sun at night. But first thing the next morning, I became a sun worshiper. Several reasons. First of all, I can see the sun, okay? Yeah. Unlike some other gods I could mention, I can actually see the sun. I'm big on that. If I can see something, I don't know, kind of helps the credibility along, So every day I can see the sun, as it gives me everything I need: heat, light, food, flowers in the park, reflections on the lake, an occasional skin cancer, but hey, at least there are no crucifixions, and we're not setting people on fire simply because they don't agree with us. Sun worship is fairly simple. There's no mystery, no miracles, no pageantry, no one asks for money, there are no songs to learn, and we don't have a special building where we all gather once a week to compare clothing. And the best thing about the sun, it never tells me I'm unworthy. Doesn't tell me I'm a bad person who needs to be saved. Hadn't said an unkind word. Treats me fine. So I worship the sun. But I don't pray to the sun. Know why? I wouldn't presume on our friendship. It's not polite. I've often thought people treat God rather rudely, don't you? Asking trillions and trillions of prayers every day, asking and pleading and begging for favors. Do this, give me that, I need a new car, I want a better job. And most of this praying takes place on Sunday, his day off. It's not nice, and it's no way to treat a friend. But people do pray, and they pray for a lot of different things. Your sister needs an operation on her crotch. Your brother was arrested for defecating in a mall. But most of all, you'd really like to fuck that hot little redhead down at the convenience store. You know, the one with the eye patch and the club foot, huh? Can you pray for that? I think you'd have to. And I say, fine, pray for anything you want. Pray for anything. But what about the divine plan? Remember that? The divine plan. Long time ago, God made a divine plan. Gave it a lot of thought, decided it was a good plan, put it into practice. And for billions and billions of years, the divine plan has been doing just fine. Now you come along and pray for something. Well, suppose the thing you want isn't in God's divine plan. What do you want him to do? Change his plan? Just for you? Doesn't it seem a little arrogant? It's a divine plan. What's the use of being God if every rundown schmuck with a $2 prayer book can come along and fuck up your plan? And here's something else, another problem you might have. Suppose your prayers aren't answered. What do you say? Well, it's God's will. Thy will be done. Fine, but if it's God's will and he's going to do what he wants to anyway, why the fuck bother praying in the first place? Seems like a big waste of time to me. Couldn't you just skip the praying part and go right to his will? It's all very confusing. So to get around a lot of this, I decided to worship the sun. But, as I said, I don't pray to the sun. You know who I pray to? Joe Pesci. Joe Pesci.
The Phil Ferguson Show is for educational and entertainment purposes only. Nothing said on the show should be interpreted as personalized investment advice. Investments should be based on your personal situation, and you, of course, should consult with your financial advisor or tax professional before taking any actions.
You're listening to The Phil Ferguson Show.
This is part 3 of the Polaris plan, and today the topic of discussion is the cushion, inside of the cushion. We already talked about what the cushion is and why you use it. Now we're going to talk about what's inside of the cushion. And so, again, like every part of this plan, there's guidelines, there's parameters, there's rules about what to do generally, but what to do specifically can be very tricky. And of course, none of this should be considered as personalized investment advice. I'm not talking to you specifically. I'm talking in general, educational content, hopefully informative, maybe on a rare occasion entertaining, but I'm going to go over some of the things that I use. And you can use different funds, but keep in mind, if you're using any fund, it should be an index fund. In my opinion, you should be using index funds, and you should have expense ratios close to or under 0.1%. There's a few exceptions in some of the more exciting bond funds that you may not be able to get that low. You're talking about under 0.25 or something for the index funds because of what they're doing and what they're investing in. Keeping the costs lower is going to be tricky. Some of the funds I mentioned will have a $3,000 minimum. There's a couple of them that might have $50,000 minimums at Vanguard. A lot of other companies have funds similar to these. And the bond funds, you can get good funds, but just look for the incredibly low costs. And I like a fund that sticks to a specific strategy, a specific idea. So, for example, if I buy a short-term bond fund, I don't want that fund buying long-term bonds. If I want to buy long-term bonds, I buy a long-term bond index fund. So, anyway, let us go through conventionally within the United States. Let's start off with 6 possible bond funds that are just your general bond funds, and they're broken up in a couple of different factors. One is the length of the bond. Short term, generally speaking, 5 years or less. Intermediate, 5 to 10, maybe years, 12 years. And long term, which is definitely maybe 10 and over or 12 and over, but sometimes 15, 18, 20 years. The bonds last that long. There's pros and cons to each of these 3 categories: short term, intermediate term, and long term. Now, again, still sticking within the United States, each one of those 3 categories, you can have a fund that is mostly or all U.S. government bonds and or mostly or all corporate bonds. What would they call this? Investment-worthy bonds. We're not talking about junk bonds. These 6 funds should have virtually no international bonds of any kind. They should have no high-yielding, aka junk bonds. These are intended to be pretty tame. Now, one of the things that can be a problem with longer-term bonds is that if interest rates go up, like in 2022, you can get whacked in longer-term bonds. And the number you want to look for, other than cost and what the fund does, what kind of bonds it buys, you want to look for a number called duration. And if you go and research a fund at the fund company, they should tell you. If not, you can put in the symbol at morningstar.com. No, I'd get nothing from them. I should. How many times I mention it? Great website. And you can look for details there and find the duration. It's a mathematical calculation. It is a way for you to visualize, I guess, or to understand how much that fund might move if interest rates move. And there's an inverse correlation, of course, just to make it tricky. So if duration is 5, if interest rates go up 1%, you could expect your bond fund to go down 5%. If the duration is 20, when interest rates go up 1%, you can expect your bond fund to go down 20%. Sometimes there's stability and things just move along like normal year after year after year. And sometimes there's really big shocks, particularly in the longer duration funds. I'm looking at the Vanguard Long-Term Treasury year to date. First 7 months of 2022, give or take, it's down 19-20%. If you thought that was a really safe and secure type of bond fund and you suddenly lost 20%, it means you didn't know what you had, and now it's a bit of a shock. Anyway, I get ahead of myself. Let me start with a couple of sample funds. And you don't have to use these specific funds, but these are ones that I've used. And if other listeners have pointed out, they're not necessarily as clean and beautiful as I might want for the clarity, but they get the job done. And part of the reason I use them is because I was using them 20 years ago when a lot of other funds didn't exist. So if you find something similar, that's fine. So for short term, I like to have short-term government and short-term corporate. And for those categories, I've chosen the 2 funds. The first one is VBIRX. That's short-term Admiral shares, mostly government bonds, and also VFSUX. These are both Admiral share funds. I think on these, the minimum to get in is $3,000 to get in at Vanguard. There are also roughly equivalent ETFs that you could use. I'm not necessarily anti-ETF, but I think the biggest downside is that you can trade them within a day. And because you think you can do something, you think it might be a good idea to do something. I don't want you trading within a day, generally speaking. I want you to buy and hold and rebalance from time to time, maybe once a year. Well, at least that's a good guideline, once a year. If something dramatic happens in the market, you can do it a little more often, in 6 months, maybe in 3 months. But after that, you're just creating work for yourself. You're creating possible tax liabilities if you're not inside of an IRA or a Roth IRA or similarly qualified account. So you don't want to overdo it. And of course, if you do it too often, the benefit goes away and you're no longer rebalancing. You're just mucking around in your portfolio. So again, the 2 short-term funds that I use, VBIRX and VFSUX. Those 2 are about as safe as you're going to get, but even with that knowledge, 2022 has been brutal to these 2 funds. They're down 5 to 6% as of June 30th of 2022. I'm not sure what they are today. They're probably not down as much. But on the other hand, they were paying interest rates below 1%, at least the government one was, and now their yields are 3.5%, give or take, maybe 4%. So that's fantastic. If you owned it at the beginning of the year, you lost 5 or 6%, but now you're going to make 3 or 4% going forward. So it evens out. in a year or two. But even that was far worse than what I expected. And by the way, the total bond fund from Vanguard as of June 30th was down 10.5%. And so by having the majority of your cushion in really painfully conservative funds, you didn't lose that money. Or at least you didn't lose as much. So that's nice. The third, actually, let me go next. Intermediate, again, at Vanguard, there's a lot of choices. I look for VSIGX and VICSX. VICSX. Numbers and letters get smaller as I get older, harder to read. So those are a couple of intermediate bond funds at Vanguard, and the duration might be between 5 and 10 years. They're very similar to the first two bonds that I mentioned, and in the past, I have used the intermediate and long-term bond funds because they generally have a little bit higher yield, which is nice. Right now, the corporate one is 3.4% yield, which is actually equivalent or maybe even a little bit lower than the short term. And that's generally not perceived as a good sign. And that's called the yield inversion. And so at this point, I don't see the value of buying intermediate bond funds because they're not going to necessarily make you any more than the short-term bond funds, and they're riskier. I mean, they can go up and down faster in the short run. And by short run, I mean a year or two. But if you were to become convinced, and I'm not convinced yet by this, here in the middle of 2022, if you get to a point where you think interest rates are not going to go up and or interest rates might go down, or if they're going to go up, they're not going to go up much, you could start putting money here and maybe make a slightly higher return and also have the advantage of diversification where different bond funds go up and down in different amounts from time to time. Sometimes they're all about the same, sometimes they're not. So it's important to know. Of course, we also have the other category, which is long-term, the long-term government fund, VLGSX. And I think that is the one, VLGSX, that I mentioned earlier in this segment, that's down 20% year to date in 22, and for all of 21 was down 5%. And I think there was a point in this within a year and a half, where all combined it was down 30%. It's since recovered a little bit, but not much. The long-term corporate is VLTCX. Now, particularly the long-term corporate at this point in time, the dividend yield is up around 5% or maybe even over 5%. And so what a change. What a change from about a year ago when, on average, most of these bond funds were paying 0.5%, 1%, 1.5%. And now some of them are 3%, 4%, or maybe even 5%. Things change, and so you have to modify and change with it. If long-term bonds get something closer to 5.5%, 6.5%, I would become very excited if their dividend, if their yield is that high, because now you start looking at a different factor, a different way of making a reasonable amount of return without a huge risk. You still have the interest rate fluctuation risk, but if interest rates are like the Fed funds rate has gone from 0 to, what is it today? 2.5, 2.75. If it goes to 4, as an example, and you think that's where it's going to end for now, well, then getting long-term bonds, if interest rates go down, you could now make a whole lot of money. Because we talked about when interest rates, so on a fund with a 20-year duration, if interest rates go up 1%, you could lose 20%. But the opposite is also true. If interest rates go down 1%, you could make 20% plus the 5% that it was already paying. And you start to get to a situation where you could have a big win short term, but you never want to have much of your money in long-term bonds, in my opinion. The two short-term funds I started with are a good foundation. Another piece of foundation, I'm now leaving the 6 primary funds that you might consider. I also use a Jenny May fund at Vanguard, VFIJX. You can get these bonds and bond funds everywhere. Again, really focus on the expense ratio. The expense ratio here for the Vanguard one, 0.11% per year. That's amazing. It's absolutely amazing. You can find other bond funds that are around 1% or even higher if you look hard enough. And when the yield is 1%, you may actually get nothing. So why would you do that? But now the yield on that fund is around 3%, way better than it was a year ago. And again, Ginnie Maes sometimes move up and down. At least the value of the index fund moves up and down in different amounts and or at different times compared to the other bond funds that I talked about. But currently the two short-term bond funds I mentioned and this Ginnie Mae fund, these are the three foundational bond funds to use. They should be, I don't know, I think 2 years ago I mentioned this, around 70, 75%, 80%, maybe even 85% of your total bond part of your portfolio. This should really be the meat and potatoes. The purpose of the cushion is for you to have money available that's working, but not making anything near what stocks make in the long run. But it's there and it's available for you to get without a whole lot of excitement, without a whole lot of loss. Three other funds that I do use in smaller amounts, and we're talking 5% of your bond portfolio, maybe 10% each if you are feeling more aggressive, particularly if you're starting to build your bond cushion, but you're further from retirement. You could use these. Three examples here. One is Total International Bond, VTABX. Another one is Emerging Market Bonds, and that is VGAVX. And then Vanguard's High Yield, aka Junk Bond Fund. I'm not sure about the first two, but I think this one might require a much larger amount of money to get in, maybe 50,000, so you could get the non-Admiral shares. But the Admiral shares are the High Yield, aka Junk Bond Fund, VWEAX. And so these are part of the cushion because every once in a while, the regular old bonds might make 2 or 3%, and one of these might make 10, 12, 15%. So if the stock market's down, or even if the stock market's up 5 or 6%, if one of your more adventuresome bond funds makes 12 or 15% and you're in retirement, that would be a great place to look at first for where to take out some money. And again, of course, it gives you an opportunity to rebalance, and you want to have a plan. So let's say you have 25% in the first three funds, 25% each of your cushion, of your bonds, in the short-term government, the short-term corporate, and the Ginnie Mae fund, 75%. And then you have, 8 1/3% in these three more interesting funds, the Total International Bond, the Emerging Market Bonds, and the High Yield Bonds. If regular bonds are up 1 or 2 or 3 or 4%, and let's say emerging market bonds are up 15%, and you're refilling the cash on hand in your investment account that you're pulling out because you're in retirement, the fund that just went up 15%, you could scoop 15, 20, 25% right off the top of that, and that might be your biggest winner for the entire year. That's why we have not only the diversification of the portfolio, and the granularity of it, but I like to have the clarity to know exactly what I own. And a lot of managed bond funds will say that they use their wisdom and their market capacities and understandings and their insider status, whatever, and they buy a mix of short-term, long-term, international, domestic, junk bonds and all these different things, and they manage all that for you. Well, if you have a bond fund that makes 3% and one that makes 15%, you can sell the one that makes 15%. If you have a bond fund that has those two things mixed together, you might have a total higher overall return in a given time period than just the conservative bond fund, but you can't sell just the part that won because you can't sell from within the bond fund. So that's why I like having all these different bond funds. So again, short-term, intermediate, long-term, government versus corporate, that creates the six conventional positions that you could use. Right now, I'm only using the short-term funds out of concern that interest rates may still go up from where they are. If we get to a point where interest rates are higher and you think, or I think, that interest rates are about as high as they're going to get in the short term, maybe then using intermediate and long-term bonds would be a reasonably good idea. Keep in mind, even in those circumstances, I would think no more than 10% in the intermediate corporate and intermediate government, and probably no more than 5% of your bond portfolio in the long-term government and the long-term corporate funds. If it happens to do really well, you could sell that position or trim that position to create cash. If they happen to do rather poorly, then you're not too bad off. If we get interest rates like we had 20 years ago, where long-term bonds are paying 7 or 8%, I might change my opinion, but just something to think about. And this is where you have some guardrails and guidelines and what to use. Keeping in mind that the most conservative bonds should be the bulk of your portfolio. After that, if you want to get creative, do that with a smaller portion of your bond portfolio. And hopefully you will make some decent, reasonable returns. The portfolio mix that I'm using currently has a current yield of about 3.45, and I expect those funds from this point forward to make 3.5 to 4% for the remainder, well, for the next 12 months. In theory, the amount you're going to make from a bond fund is its yield. Because in theory, if you buy a bond for $1,000 and you sell a bond for $1,000, you didn't make or lose any money. What you made in the meantime was the yield. So it's very, very important what the yield is. Keeping in mind the yield, generally speaking, is the maximum amount you will make, and your yield will be reduced by any defaults. And so that's why you want high quality bond funds. And since I segued into this, let me touch on that real quick. Quality bonds and quality bond funds are usually measured by Moody's and Standard & Poor's bond rating agencies. There's all kinds of flaws and problems there, and historically they've made terrible mistakes in overrating, particularly housing market, housing bonds. Think about 2007, 2008, when the market went really bad, partly because of home loans and the bonds and weird things issued around them. But the top tier of quality is AAA, AA, and then A. And then you have triple B. So triple B and above, A, AA, AAA, those are all considered investment grade bonds. And that's fine. You want a mix of those. If it's a government bond fund, it's generally going to be mostly, if not all, AAA. And that's okay. But AAA bonds will pay smaller dividends because they can. A AA might pay a little more. A triple B will pay even more. Generally, a mix in a corporate fund, you'll have more bias towards A and triple B. In a government bond fund, you'll have AA and a lot of AAA. If you get below triple B to BB and below, so you have BB, double B, single B, C or lower, those are considered junk bonds. It's not necessarily anything to panic about, but if you buy a general fund, you just think it's a short-term corporate fund and it's paying 6% yield right now, when the going rate might be 3.5 to 4, you might want to look inside of the fund, and you can, again, do that at morningstar.com. And if you find out that 30 or 40 or 50% of it is a junk in junk bonds rated B, double B or lower, it's not necessarily awful, but you don't own what you thought you owned. So if you thought that was your short-term corporate safe kind of bond, but half of the portfolio's in junk bonds, you could have a situation like we've had in the last 7 months where the junk bond funds are down 11%. Some years, junk bond funds or emerging markets or the international bonds can make 10, 15, or 20% in a year, but they can also lose numbers like that. That's why they're a smaller part of your portfolio. You want to focus on something pretty safe and reliable, because the cushion, the primary purpose of the cushion, is to be there when the stock market goes down. So what percent of your money should be in the cushion versus stocks? It depends. I know I've already covered this a couple times, but there's no one right answer. A default answer that is overly simplified might be 40% cushion, 60% stock at retirement or close to retirement. But for some people, the mix is 50-50. For some people, having 60% in bonds might be what they want to do. For some people, my parents, as an example, They had my dad, when he passed away at the age of 81, had 10% in the cushion and 90% in stocks. And you might think, well, why would he do that? Well, they lived well below their means, which is great, but I thought it was a little overbalanced to the conservative, and they could have spent more money before they passed away, but they chose not to. Their primary goal was to leave it to their kids, which I'm one of three and a benefactor of that philosophy. And they were willing to take more risk because it wasn't for them. And they were still, even in their late 70s, long-term investors because the money was for their descendants. So you can take more risk if the money's not for you. You can take more risk if you don't need the money. You can take more risk if you live on an income that's a very small percentage of the size of your portfolio. You can take more risk in your investments if you can live 100% on a pension or two combined with Social Security, combined with a part-time job. However you cobble together enough money to live on, if you don't need to touch the portfolio, you can go to 100% stocks. Not necessarily the best idea for me to mention out loud, but that might be the right number for you. For most people, it's not. It's not even close. But a very small amount in the cushion would be for someone that has other sources of income in retirement, or can work and make some supplemental money easily in retirement by doing consulting work. Or if you're a nurse and you come out of retirement for 3 months and can pocket 50, 60 grand somewhere, then you don't have to have as much in the cushion. Although on the other hand, sometimes people with the biggest portfolios that aren't really concerned about how much their kids get or how much a charity gets, they might go to 50% cushion because they just don't want to worry about it. They don't care. They don't care if the bonds make 3 or 4% versus the theoretical 10 that the stocks might make, because in either case, they're going to be fine. If the bonds don't make a lot, they're going to be fine. If the bonds make a lot, they're going to be fine. I mean, that's kind of a wonderful place to be if you have a portfolio big enough that you can be overly conservative and not worry about it. The part of your portfolio that's bonds might also get bigger if interest rates are really low, and it could get smaller if interest rates are really big. It's easy to see that if the bonds are paying an average of 2% yield, they're not going to yield that much money. If they're paying an average 6% yield, and you're taking out 5% every year from the portfolio, well, the bonds not only covered their 5%, but a whole lot more that's not covered by the stocks. And also the stock market over time has varying amounts of dividends that it pays. So keep that in mind. The less money you need, the higher the dividends are, the less you can have in bonds if you so choose. And again, you can assign it as a certain percentage. I like to calculate how many years the cushion will last. Just a quick recap. You have $1 million, you take out 5%, $50,000. If it's half bonds and half stocks, I'm making this painfully easy. If the stocks on average are paying 3%, that's $15,000. If the bonds are paying 6%, that's $30,000. Yeah. So you have $45,000 of the $50,000 that you need without selling a thing. And then you can pick and choose where to sell from there. In that case, you could make the bond part even smaller. Anyway, I'm repeating myself, but that's kind of how the bond part, the cushion, is comprised. Those are some funds that I use. If I made this all confusing, or maybe I misspoke and gave the wrong symbol, you can send me an email, phil@polarisfinancialplanning.com, and I can try to fix it. Hopefully that is helpful.
Pace e lunga vita.
Lunga vita e prosperità.
He loves you and he needs money. He always needs money. He's all powerful, all perfect, all knowing, and all wise. Somehow, just can't handle money. Religion takes in billions of dollars. They pay no taxes, and they always need a little more. Now, you talk about a good bullshit story. Holy shit.
The Phil Ferguson Show is for educational and entertainment purposes only. Nothing said on the show should be interpreted as personalized investment advice. Investments should be based on your personal situation, and you, of course, should consult with your financial advisor or tax professional before taking any action.
You're listening to The Phil Ferguson Show.
Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening to The Phil Ferguson Show. And of course, if you like the show, you can go leave a 5-star review somewhere, or you can share a link to the show with a friend, or post it on your wall, or share one of my posts. I would greatly appreciate that. Of course, today was part 3 of the Polaris plan, all about the cushion. Hopefully that was helpful. And again, as I said in the segment, if you have questions or I caused confusion, email me, phil@polarisfinancialplanning.com. Still have a lot of things going on. I know I've mentioned previously that we're moving to Florida, and that's in process. One of the nice things is we bought something like 75-80% of all the furniture in their house. So we already have all the furniture, and we've taken some clothes and some other small light things that you could take on an airplane down there. And of course, all the food and cleaning supplies we just bought locally. No reason to pay to move those. And now the big question is, how much more stuff do we want to move? Because moving is wickedly expensive. I don't know exactly, but I think even one of those shipping containers you can have dropped off at your house, if we decided to pack one of those and have it transported and then unpack it, it could easily be $3,000 to $5,000 to move a bunch of stuff. And I'm thinking maybe instead of spending that money to move stuff, I'd just buy stuff there, and I don't have to deal with moving stuff. But we don't know for sure what we're going to do in the for all the details. The other thing, of course, is Polaris. I applied to be federally registered, and the SEC has now, I guess the right word would be to say, to recognize my company. I'm now registered federally. I can't say they approved me, because one of the things is I can't say they didn't approve me. I'm not approved. They're not saying that I'm competent or capable of doing my job in any way, only that I've filled out the proper paperwork, and they've now recognized that I've filled out the proper paperwork, and I'm federally registered, or at least, me and Polaris is federally registered. So that's moving forward. At some point, I'll have to change the address to Florida. So now I'm working on getting all the things necessary to do that for the business, for me personally. So a lot of things going on, but it's good things, right? I could have worse problems. Basically wraps up the show for today. And next episode, of course, will be the Polaris Plan Part 4. And I'm going to have to double check what I did last time. 2 years ago, it was 6 parts. And I'm thinking it still will be 6 parts, maybe 7. I'm not sure how it's going to break out yet. But the next part, we'll talk some more about stocks, and we'll have fun with that. And I'm just going to wrap up with that, and I'll talk to you in the next episode. And of course, I hope to see you out there on the road sometime soon. Until then, ciao.
They sent some men up to the moon to find the secret of life. They spent $4 billion, could have helped this world of strife. They didn't find the secret in the moonstones that they found. They should have come to my town. We got rocks all over the ground. Oh, we didn't come from monkeys. We didn't swing from trees. We're not a piece of seaweed blowing in the breeze. It wasn't a big explosion that caused you and me. We know God created you and me. A teacher told me long ago 2 fireballs in the sky were coming toward each other. Why, it's enough to make you cry. She said there was a big explosion that caused you and me. My old Ford backfired. I thought I was raising a family. Oh, we didn't come from monkeys. We didn't swing from trees. We're not a piece of seaweed blowing in the breeze. It wasn't a big explosion that caused you and me. We know God created you and me. I stood beside a professor one day at the zoo. He said, looking at the monkeys, why, they're related to me and you. He got a little irate when I said I didn't agree, but I'd have to admit they looked more like him than me. Oh, we didn't come from monkeys. We didn't swing from trees. We're not a piece of seaweed blowing in the breeze. It wasn't a big explosion that caused you and me. We know God created you and me. One more time. We know God created you and me.
One more time.
We know God created you and me.
That's enough.